Overnight, Ukraine mounted what appears to be the biggest single drone and missile attack against Russian territory since the start of the war. What does this mean for the conflict? Overnight last night, the Russians mounted a sustained attack against Kyiv with around 20 drones in what was described as a massive attack with 2 people dying. But despite that, the big news was Ukrainian attacks on Moscow and on Russian territory. There were 6 regions of Russia that were attacked last night in the biggest wave of attacks by Ukraine ever since the war started 18 months ago. Now, most of these targets were around the southwest of Russia, relatively close to Ukraine border. But of note, Ukraine has also seemed to target Pskov, which is a Russian military airfield only about 20 miles away from the Latvian border. Apparently 10 to 20 drones attacked that airfield overnight. In addition to that, though, the Russians claim they shot down a number of Ukraine drones targeting Crimea, and also there were more drones targeting Moscow, and that ended up with the Moscow airspace being closed down for a significant period last night. Why were these attacks significant? Were they as a result of Ukrainian frustration that the front line hasn't moved much over the last 10 weeks? Or is the timing of these attacks linked to the next phase of the conflict? It's worth looking at Pskov, the airfield at Pskov, in more detail, where the Russians based their IL-76. These are big Russian transport aircraft that are used to ferry supplies around the front line. By targeting those, it's stopping Russia moving some of its key equipment around. Now, they shouldn't be vulnerable, but the reality was these aircraft were not protected, they were not in hardened aircraft shelters, and although Russia claimed that only 2 had been damaged initially, subsequent reports suggested that at least 2 were blazing away and were certainly destroyed, and 2 more looked to be significantly damaged. The timing of this is also interesting because the front line has been relatively static for the last 10 weeks, despite huge efforts for Ukraine to make a breakthrough. But Ukraine has been gradually working its way through the layered defense of Russia, particularly around Robotyne, which is just to the east of Zaporizhia, and it looks likely that they might be on the verge of some major breakthrough. Now, conventional wisdom would suggest that Russia would therefore reinforce the area to plug that gap before Ukrainians could break through. But if Ukraine could sow a few seeds of doubt in the Russian minds by targeting Crimea, targeting the east of Zaporizhia, targeting to the north of Donbass, and also Moscow, it would cause Russia to try to establish where they're going to put their reserves and almost certainly not move them at all. And the attacks on the transport fleet back up that hypothesis that this is almost certainly, we're on seeing the cusp of a potentially significant breakthrough by Ukraine. When looking at why Ukraine are using drones, one has to remember that Ukraine is the David to the Russian Goliath. They're a much smaller nation and they have to use asymmetric tactics in order to prevail in this war. Now, drones can be either long range or short range. They're relatively cheap, they're relatively easy to procure. The downside is they're quite vulnerable. They are not equipped with a great deal of self-protection and they're relatively easy to shoot down. But some do get through. Quantity has a quality all of its own. The key factor about drones is they are able to be innovated overnight. The Russians do not innovate, but the Ukrainians have proved very, very effective at seeing where there are any shortfalls in these drones' capability, rewiring them, reprogramming them overnight so they're ready to go into combat the next day. And that's proving remarkably effective and agile, which is critical to battlefield success. And what the 3 main areas where these drones are proving effective, one of which is addressing Russian complacency. Russians have left their big strategic aircraft out in the open on an airfield, which makes them very vulnerable to drones. The Ukrainian attacks against Moscow are not achieving a great deal of success tactically on the ground, but strategically the psychological effect of these regular attacks means that Putin can't claim that he's protecting Russians. And finally, on the front line, these little drones, these nano drones, are proving very effective at being the eyes and the ears over the battlefield. The one thing that drone warfare has absolutely been synonymous with this battle, it's been a game changer and will have profound implications for the way defense and the militaries are configured around the world after this conflict is over.